Hello everyone and welcome back. On this week's episode, I'm going to do something a little bit different. Most of my videos focus on creating terrain, but I'm also a miniature painter. And working with some other YouTube creators out there, they have a monthly challenge, which is to paint a squig using only 3 colors and whatever your primer color is, in which case mine is black. You can also only use 2 brushes. The goal of this, of course, is to show that you don't need tons of supplies and expensive materials to be able to paint something to a relatively tabletop degree or more. So let's jump in. The idea here is I am starting with just 3 colors and a black. So I'm going to use some color theory throughout this video to create my squig. I have selected a pallid witch flesh, an electric blue, and a deep red, and of course a flat black. As far as priming goes, I opted to use the Citadel Spray Black, but you can also use this brush-on primer as well. Again, it's pretty cheap to do. The cans are a lot more expensive. You probably get more bang for your buck with the brush on. It's just faster to spray them on. So something also that is part of the challenge is only being able to use 2 different brushes, which means I can't use dry brushes. I can't use multiple different types without sacrificing somewhere else. So I have opted for a size 4 brush and a size 1 brush. Now my 4 brush is a Winsor Newton 7 series brush. My other is a Blick Art brush. Now that I've got my colors, something to talk about here is color theory. This is a color wheel you can pick up relatively cheap on Amazon or anywhere else. I'll have links in the description down below. But what it shows you is all of the different colors that exist and all the different variations. They're complementary colors, and it's just really something key to use. There's also apps on your phone. I have a few different apps that I use of this exact same thing, but this is what I'm going to use to make sure that I can get as much out of these 4 different paints as possible. So let's take another look at this color wheel here. On the outside rim of the color wheel are your hues. Those are your primary colors. Now, if I also take a white and mix it with that hue, I will get the tint. If I take that primary color again, the hue on the outer rim, and I mix it with a gray, I will have a tone, and I can change the tone of that color. And lastly, if I add a black to that hue, I then will have a shade. So I selected a white, a black, and then 2 other colors that mix well together so that I could pull off a greater variety of potential colors for things like shading and highlighting, given the restrictions that I have. So, knowing the basics of some color theory there, let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to put on my base coat. I've primed this model black already, so now I'm just applying the base. And the first thing I'm starting with here is my deep red from scale 75. I'm going to leave parts of the top layer of the model still with that primer layer because I'm going to put a different base layer on that section and then a final one on the very tippity top of the model. I'm going to mix my electric blue and my deep red, and I'm going to create a layer just above my red where I've already creating a transition from that red color up to the purple that I've created by combining those 2 colors. And then lastly, I'm going to put my electric blue on the top and create a strip and kind of make strokes side to side to give it a little bit more texture across the surface of the squig. I'm also going to do the lips around the edge in that very same blue color. So now that I've done that, I'm going to work on the gums a little bit. So to do this, I'm just going to take a little bit of my pallid witch flesh and some of my deep red, and I'm going to mix them together more on the red side so that I have a deeper, darker looking pink, so that when I put on a highlight, it really adds to that depth. I'm going to shade down my deep red a little bit more so I can do a little bit of the underside. Later I'm going to add some deep purple to this as well, but I want to make it go from a deeper red up to the standard deep red and then go up to my blue highlight up top. So on the undersides and in the places where there should be shadow, I'm going to add this very, very dark shaded red. Next up, I'm going to create a dark purple, and I'm going to do this by mixing my red, my blue, and then adding in a little bit of that black to shade it down, so that again, I can add in a little bit of depth in the mix, and it works really well going from the deep red to the red and making that transition color and blending those defined lines between the different colors. Once this is done, I'm going to take just pure deep red, and I'm going to begin the long, arduous process of highlighting all of the raised areas. The tops of muscles, the top of really any joint that I see that's in that red line. I'm going to start adding the highlight, letting it dry while I work on other highlights on the other side, then coming back to it. And I did this quite a lot. And you'll see here, I do it until it looks pretty good, then I let it dry, then I do it again, and again, and again. Now I'm going to move on a little bit while that dries, and I'm going to work further on the gums, working to bring those highlights up. Again, taking our deep red and our Pallid Witch Flesh and adding to the gum line. Now taking strictly Pallid Witch Flesh, I'm going to color in the teeth and the bone. And what you're going to do is you're going to cover this as best you can. Remember that you're painting a white over a black surface. Lighter colors are a little bit finicky when covering darker surfaces. They need more layers, in which case it works out because I'm going to use this as an advantage to help me show some of the shadows underneath and then really bring things up to a highlight. I'm also going to mix in a little bit of blue with my Pallid Witch Flesh and start working on that ridge line from the top of the face all the way back to the back of the tail. And that line gets thinner and thinner as we go. So the highlighted area basically focuses in a strip going down the tail. And I'm using some of those same stroke patterns from side to side as I go to give it, again, a little bit of texture along the top. For the bone, I'm going to go back now and I'm going to add a little bit of shade to it. So I'm going to add a little bit of black to give me an almost gray, but not quite, just a toned down black. And I'm going to hit all of the little spots underneath the base of the teeth and underneath all the curves and everything from the bone. And this is going to allow me to basically change the tone of the bone and the teeth without having a bone color paint to work with. This is pretty much as close as I'm going to be able to make it work to go from a shadowed spot of the bone all the way up to a very bright Pallid Witch Flesh highlight. Now I'm taking a little bit of the Pallid Witch Flesh and I'm starting to mark all of the little warts and everything all over the miniature. And while those dry, I'm going to start highlighting the gums. And for this, we're doing the same thing as before. We're taking our deep red, our Pallid Witch Flesh, although now we're using more of the Pallid Witch Flesh to bring up the brightness of that pink and starting to highlight all of the raised areas of the gum line and the high points where the tips meet the teeth to make them as bright as possible. Going back to the Pallid Witch Flesh, I re-upped some of the little warts to make them even brighter at their highest points, but I'm also going through now and highlighting the raised muscle tissue. And there's a little scar mark of a moon where this creature's been branded. I want all of those to be white. And what I'm going to do here is just bring up that color with the Pallid Witch Flesh a little bit, let it dry, then I'm going to hit it with this deep red, and that is going to make a fantastic highlight at the very top of the muscles and around all the scar markings and everything. Typically what'll happen is it'll start to look pink. Whether you're covering it with red or you're mixing it with red, red goes on very translucent, so it's going to make it look pink. The trick to that is put on a layer, let it go pink, let it dry, move on to the next spot, let it go pink, go back to the previous spot, hit it with red again, and keep doing this until it makes a nice dark bright red. For the underside of the chin and some of the undersides of the model, I went back and I used a mix of my Pallid Witch Flesh and my deep red again, so I could bring up a deep pink looking color underneath the chin and some of the bottom sides of the model. I'm also going to use my Pallid Witch Flesh and blend this into the tip of the tail as the tail is raised up so that it makes it transition from a deep underside color to a much lighter tip, creating a highlight. And of course, we're going to do the nails in the same type of texture using the bone color, the Pallid Witch Flesh, as they are going to match the rest of the model. So the tricky part here was doing the base. I didn't have the right colors to make any sort of brown, so I figured I would just use a color that would complement the model as best I could. And to do that, what I did was make a deep purple using the electric blue, the deep red, and the flat black, and I mix it to make a very, very deep color. Now, as needed, to bring up the color as I go over rocks and pebbles, I basically created my purple color again with a little bit of white mixed in this time. And that helps bring up the highlight color, so the top of those little rocks and everything underneath will start to get lighter and lighter in purple until eventually they are a highlighted Pallid Witch Flesh, which matches the highlights at the rest of the squig model. And there you have it. One squig painted with only 3 colors and a black to work with, and I think it came out pretty good. Obviously, learning a little bit of color theory will help make this a lot easier, and of course, spending a bit of time. This overall project took me a little over 2 hours to complete, so if you have a lot of squigs and you want to bring stuff up to this level, either paint really, really fast. I'm a very slow painter, so you can probably do it better than I can, but just learning those basics of color theory, you can accomplish a lot with very little. I want to thank you guys, as always, for checking out my videos. We actually just hit 100 subscribers, which I know is a small fish in a very big pond out there, but it means the world to me, so thank you all for sharing my content. And of course, as always, happy crafting, and we will see you guys next time.